Hi, I'm Adam Schembri from the University of Birmingham in Hi, I'm Adam Schembri from the University of Birmingham in the UK, and I'm here to talk about native signer ideologies in Auslan and BSL linguistics. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm originally from Australia and I've worked in the UK for a number of years. And I've worked primarily on these two sign languages, Auslan, the majority sign language of the Australian deaf community, and British Sign Language, because these two sign languages are historically related. Now, I want to talk about the role of native signer ideologies in Auslan and BSL linguistics today, and particularly the way it's influenced the research design for a lot of the studies that I have done over my career. Now, my work began on sign language variation and change in 2003, and with a study looking at Australian Sign Language. And at that point in time, the major influence on my work came from groundbreaking work conducted on variation and change in the American Sign Language, led by Seal Lucas, Clayton Valley, and their team based at Gallaudet University in the US. Now, what's really interesting is when I went on to design studies looking at variation and change in Auslan and BSL, I was greatly influenced by the research methodology that was used in the original ASL studies. In fact, a lot of the work that I've done has attempted to replicate some of the American studies for Auslan and BSL. So as such, knowing that I wanted to replicate and compare variation and change in these two sign languages with the original research on ASL meant that I paid a lot of attention to aspects of their research design, and in particular, participant selection. So if you look at this excerpt book by Lucas et al., published in 2001, you can see that the participant selection criteria are very clearly reflect native signer ideologies. But what's really interesting at the time is that most sign language linguistics in the early noughties and for the previous decades had focused almost exclusively on deaf people from deaf families, so-called native signers. But what I found interesting about the work that Valley and others were doing, where they were broadening out the selection criteria for participants to include both deaf people who were exposed to sign language from birth and deaf people who had acquired sign languages a little later in life. And this was a bit more reflective of the linguistic diversity in the deaf community, but it still reflected kind of native signer, native speaker ideologies, in the sense that there was a focus on deaf people who acquired sign languages very, very young. So as you see here, their focus was on deaf individuals from deaf families who learned to sign natively in the home, as well as deaf individuals who learn to sign before age of 5 or 6 from their peers in residential schools. This was motivated by the fact that they wanted to exclude people who may have acquired sign languages later in life and as a first language, or as indeed to exclude those who had acquired it as a second language after having successfully acquired a spoken language. Now, when it came to the design of the two major research projects on Auslan and BSL that I've been involved with, we pretty much adapted this kind of approach without question. We expanded the range slightly, so we decided to recruit signers who had reported learning to sign Auslan or BSL by the age of 7. But we still very much, still a large proportion of the participants in the studies that we undertook were deaf people from deaf families, but we also included deaf people from hearing families if they self-reported having acquired Auslan or BSL by the age of 7. Now, there are two main data sets that I'm going to be talking about. One on Auslan, which consists of actually data that was collected as part of two projects. So initially, a project on sociolinguistic variation and change in Auslan, which filmed 211 deaf people. That was followed by the Auslan Corpus project, which filmed another 100 deaf people. There was some overlap between those participants in both projects. So all in all, we recorded 255 deaf signers of Auslan in 5 major cities across Australia. You can see them represented on the map here. Then when I moved to the UK, I again replicated this approach with the British Sign Language Corpus project team. And we recruited 249 deaf signers from 8 cities. You can see the names of the cities on the map there across the UK. And again, we used the same criteria, focusing on deaf people from deaf families and those who are deaf people who reported signing before the age of 7. Now, what's really interesting is that on reflection, when I did a survey of most of the studies that have come out of these two projects, it's really interesting that native signer status is revealed to rarely play a role in any of the linguistic features investigated. So we've done a number of studies on the Auslan data, all of which are listed here. All of these were quantitative studies in which one of the social factors that we entered into the analysis was what we called language background, where we divided signers into a binary of either native signer, being deaf from a deaf family, or early learner, being deaf from a hearing family, having acquired Auslan before the age of 7. And if you look at the list of the features that we've investigated, in none of these was language background a significant factor. So it turned out that in our data, we didn't see differences between deaf people from deaf families and deaf people who were early learners of Auslan in their use of fingerspelling, in phonological variation due to location, in the use of indicating verbs, in the use of prodrop, variable subject presence, in the use of Finnish, the sign Finnish as an aspect marker in Auslan, and also the use of mouthing of English words and mouth gestures. So in none of these lexical or grammatical features of the language did we find language background, native signer status, as being a significant factor at all. And similarly, using data from the BSL corpus, looking at variation in hand shape, in the use of nativized fingerspelling, again in the use of indicating verbs and the use of mouthing, as well as sign duration and signing rates, again, we did not find language background to be significant in any of these studies. The one study that we have done from the BSL corpus, which looked at lexical variation and change, in which language background was significant, was the fact that we found that deaf people from deaf families were much more likely to use traditional regional signs compared to those deaf people from hearing families. No doubt, because a lot of the traditional regional signs are older signs that would be used by the deaf parents or indeed deaf grandparents of those signers. And so this is an unsurprising result. It simply reflects the differing language experiences in terms of exposure to traditional lexical variation for those who've come from deaf versus hearing families. So overall, though, we find that, as I've said, that we consistently fail to identify differences in the studies of phonology and grammar between native signers and early learners of Auslan and BSL. So even though the ideology informed our research design, what's really come out of the research based on that research design is that in many cases, it does not seem to be a significant factor influencing the use of a range of lexical and grammatical features in Auslan or BSL. So thanks for your attention, and all of the references, all of the studies are listed here in the reference list. So thank you again.